Okay. Welcome, everyone. So happy to see all of you here. I'm Ann Russo, and I'm a professor in Women's and Gender Studies and the director of the Women's Center here at DePaul University. And yeah, I'm just so glad to see you come in for this important conversation, refusing erasure, the ongoing struggle for critical ethnic, Black, queer, trans, and feminist studies. It's so very, very timely, important, urgent. We were just talking about every day there's more news of more attacks, bans, laws, and more. And yet there's also like amazing resistance, right? And there's an amazing and powerful, the communities and connections we've created are still also there, right? And figuring out how to protect one another, how to resist together, how to take care of one another. And so we're hoping to hold up both this evening, right? The both and of all the efforts at erasure and at all the efforts of existence and living and joy and care and continuing our work of building knowledge, of building movement, etc. So welcome. I'm happy to welcome our speakers this evening, who I know are going to offer us, perspective, analysis, guidance, possibility as we continue to navigate these realities. So I want us, we'll have a bigger introduction, but let's welcome Dr. Marquise Bay, Dr. Jillian Hernandez, and Dr. Kyla Adia-Story. So honored to have you here this evening. And Kyla, I just want to do a shout out that it's wonderful to have you back in community. Dr. Kyla Adia-Story graduated from DePaul with a BA in Women's Studies, around 20 plus years ago. So it's wonderful to have you back in community with us always. Again, thanks to each of you for joining us. We're looking forward to your insight, analysis, etc. And welcome to each of you in our audience this evening. So happy to have you here. So I want to offer a few gratitudes for those who have made the event possible. I want to thank the student workers always in the Women's Center, Keish Lozano for creating our flyer, Rena Shenoy, Shamim Razek, Anna Molk, Grace Sigelman, and Aviv Goldman for all their work in the center. I want to thank Drs. Heather Montes Ireland, Leila Farah, and Rocio Ferreira of Women's and Gender Studies for really organizing the event, for envisioning it, supporting, and working with me to develop this event organized by Women's and Gender Studies and the Women's Center. And I want to thank our co-organizers and co-collaborators, Dr. Lee Jin of Global Asian Studies, Dr. Julie Moody Freeman of African and Black Diaspora Studies and the Center for Black Diaspora, Dr. Billy Johnson Gonzalez of the Center for Latino Research, Dr. Carolina Sternberg of Latin American Latino Studies, Dr. Allison McCracken of American Studies, and Barry Borich of LGBTQ Studies. So thank you for all your support of the event and getting the word out at this late date in our quarter. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heather Montes Ireland, who's going to be our moderator this evening. Dr. Heather Montes Ireland is an assistant professor in DePaul's Women's and Gender Studies Department, and also is an affiliated faculty in the Latin American and Latino Studies Department, the Critical Ethnic Studies Department, and the LGBTQ Studies Program. Her research and teaching specializations include Latina, Chicana, Boricua feminisms, queer of color critique, and intersectional feminist economic justice. She's a 2022-23 faculty fellow in the DePaul Center for Latino Research. So please welcome Dr. Heather Montes Ireland. Thank you very much, Heather, for moderating this evening and, organizing this conversation we're going to have. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Russo. I have to send some of that gratitude back your way. And really just want to thank you so much for organizing this, for bringing a spirit of collaboration among all of our interdisciplinary units, and for really at this late point in the quarter to imagine that this event could happen and really manifesting it. So, and also thank you for inviting me to moderate this conversation today. So it's such a pleasure. Welcome everyone. I wanted to start today by actually introducing our panelists. I wanted to do that first so that you get a sense of how we're thinking about how we'd like this conversation to go today. And then of course, we'll let it take the shapes that it does. After I introduce our panelists, I'd also like to share just a few comments with you all. Just especially for folks who maybe are coming into the conversation, like you're interested, but you haven't been able to really keep up with maybe everything that's been happening in relation to these attacks on critical ethnic studies, Black studies, women's and gender studies, queer and trans studies. I'll give you just a little bit of a framing, and then we have some questions prepared for the panelists. So we'll do that at that point. Okay. So I'll start by introducing our esteemed panelists today, and I just have to make sure. Oh, I have so many tabs going, so I have to make sure I have my right tabs in front of me. Okay, here we go. So today we have with us three panelists. First, we have Dr. Marquise Bey, an assistant professor of African American Studies and English and core faculty in gender and sexuality studies and critical theory here at Northwestern University, our neighbors. There were concerns, Black feminist theorizing, transgender and non-binary studies, abolition, and contemporary African American literature. Marquise Bey is the author most recently of Black trans feminism, as well as System Failure Essays on Blackness and Cisgender, both which were published in 2022 by Duke University Press. And we're so happy to have Dr. Marquise Bey back speaking with us again. They were here talking with us about Black trans feminism not too long ago. So welcome, Dr. Bey. We also have Dr. Jillian Hernandez, who studies the autonomous aesthetics, genders, and sexualities of Black and Latinx people. Her scholarship crosses the fields of art history, performance, gender, ethnic, Latinx, and Black studies, and is informed by her work as a community arts educator, curator, and cultural producer. Her book is The Aesthetics of Excess, The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment, also published by Duke University Press. I have it right over here next to me, and traces how the body practices and art making of Black and Latinx women and girls are intertwined, and how they complicate conventional notions of cultural value and sexual respectability through creative authorship. Also, Dr. Jillian Hernandez is an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Florida. So we're just, again, so thankful that you're speaking with us today. And we also have Dr. Kyla Adiastori, who's an award-winning associate professor and podcaster, and might I add, a DePaul University alum. I know Dr. Russo just said that, but I have to say it again, especially for folks still coming in the room. Dr. Story is dually appointment in the departments of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville. She also holds the Audre Lorde Endowed Chair at the University of Louisville. Dr. Story is the co-creator, co-producer, and co-host of Louisville Public Media's Strange Fruit, a popular and award-winning 8-year running podcast. Dr. Story was named also as an LGBTQ+ community leader and change maker as a part of NBC's inaugural Pride 30. Recently, Dr. Story was chosen as the 2022 champion of Pride for the state of Kentucky by The Advocate magazine. This is amazing to have you all here. So yes, please join me with a round of applause and welcome to all of our panelists today. Oh, y'all, thank you so much. It's beautiful to be able to read about you and your work and share that with everyone. So I want to start now with just sort of framing the conversation a little bit, and welcome to all of you who may be here because you are part of these programs and fields, right, that are named in the title that we have and refusing erasures. But there might be folks here too who are just interested in what's been going on out there. So I have a few comments about that, and I'll start with that now, and then we'll move into questions, as I mentioned. So in the 1960s and 70s, for folks who don't know, there was a wave of student and university-based protests that established ethnic studies and women's studies programs in institutions across the country, right? There is a long history of struggles to establish these programs, to maintain them, and to expand them, and to expand access to the history, struggles, resistance, and cultures of US peoples of color, and of women, queer, and gender expansive communities, right? So this is our legacy that we enter this conversation in today. Indeed, since there have been programs in ethnic studies, African American and Black studies, and women's gender and sexuality studies, there have also been forces seeking the rolling back of human rights and the destruction of these liberatory fields. And while the institutionalization of these critical interdisciplines has not always met the radical goals that we all hope for, still, for decades, generations of students and faculty have found intellectual and political homes in these programs, have fought against white supremacist and colonial powers in the university and beyond, and have made cultural and social change, empowered with their ethnic studies, Black studies, Latino studies, and women's studies education. All along, we have seen the power of creating new liberatory knowledge forms, and we have fought for these programs. And now, amidst these ongoing struggles, as well, and continued austerity measures, the corporatization of universities, and neoliberal racial capitalist formations of labor and debt, there have been renewed attacks by ultra-conservative, alt-right, and white nationalist movements and their leaders against our fields, and indeed against all forms of liberatory knowledges. So just for a very short overview, right, we have seen especially the misinformation campaign against critical ethnic studies and anti-racist education, the off-labeled like CRT issue that I'm sure everyone has heard at some point over the past couple of years. African American studies and histories and the guttings of histories of slavery, segregation, and white supremacy. Latine, Latinx, and Latino studies and the attacks on ethnic studies giving rise since the Erasure fight about a decade or more ago, efforts to delegitimize women's and gender studies anew. And all of that is happening alongside these campaigns where we're seeing the attacks on like the funds of knowledge of trans youth, the funds of knowledge that they hold, and trans and gender expansive communities generally, as well as against public knowledge, right, in the library, right, through book challenges and book bans. Most recently, you may have heard that the NAACP has issued a travel advisory to the state of Florida for Black people and other people of color in an attempt to, bring attention to the quote, all-out attack on Black Americans, accurate Black history, voting rights, members of the LGBTQ+ community, immigrant rights, reproductive rights, and free speech, unquote, that is being waged by Florida's public officials. At the same time, we know that what happens in a state like Florida is happening all over this country and in many places throughout the world. And what is happening in some states in the US is meant to set an agenda for the entire US. We also know of reported hundreds of anti-LGBTQ+ bills that have been introduced in state legislatures throughout the US just this year, with numbers ranging from 417 anti-LGBTQ bills to upwards of 600. A new record, a terrible one. According to the data from ACLU, this is the most that we've ever seen. These bills are proposing attacks on trans and queer youth and adults, access to gender-affirming care, and they also heavily focus on regulating school curriculums, right, in public schools, including discussions around gender identity and sexuality. And so right, these attacks on public schools and on primary education and then secondary education are also related to and impact universities, their / our curricular offerings, goals for already tenuous diversity, equity, inclusion and justice objectives, and our broader academic freedoms. So today, folks, we want to hold space to discuss and better understand these fights and to center ways of resisting as we refuse the erasures of our knowledges, our communities, and our lives. And we want to think together about the role of critical ethnic studies, women's and gender studies, queer and trans studies, and resistance to these attacks, and the role these programs, students, faculty, and supporters can have in imagining a world otherwise and beyond, reactions to these relentless and sustained destructive forces. So I would like to now turn to some questions for the panel. And I don't know if it's best just to kind of start by offering up the question, and then we can start by whoever wants to jump in, and then I'll try to see for the next question if I can take a different order. Okay. But we just wanted to start today by asking you all where you sit. Can you talk about what you see showing up in your communities and your institutions, your workplaces and environments, whether that is, just local issues or beyond. So we'd like to start there, just kind of hearing from you in terms of what each of you is contending with. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, okay.
I guess
yeah,
I can start. I'm happy to start. Hi.
Great.
So I am at the University of Florida. I've been at the University of Florida in the Women's Studies department. Well, we are officially a department now. We were a center last year for 5 years now. Previously, I was at UC San Diego in the Ethnic Studies department and Critical Gender Studies program. And when the job opened up in Florida, I was really excited to come back home. And people were like, oh, you're going back to Florida. Like, why are you doing that? Right. It's so, we all know, the reasons for that. But I don't regret my decision. I'm really glad to be where I am at the moment. Because the importance of sort of being with one's people when these things are happening is so important. So what we've been seeing at the University of Florida, and I'm not speaking, I have to give the disclaimer, I'm not speaking on behalf of the University of Florida. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Florida. I'm sharing my own views. So what we've been seeing have been several attempted limitations at how we can talk about race and gender and class at the university. So about 2 years ago, there was a House Bill 7 that was attempting to limit ways in which you could speak about race. So like you couldn't say that the US was like inherently racist. You couldn't critique like meritocracy, like these really quite specific and stringent sort of regulations that made clear what their objectives were, right? It was very much about framing a kind of educational narrative that does not question the given, structures of power and the histories that are a part of those. And so after about 1.5 years of teaching under those conditions, it's under injunction currently. And then now this year we have SB 266, which is a House bill that initially the language actually called for an outright banning of gender studies and queer theory and radical feminism. Now it has much more broad language, also something to the effect of like, you can't say that the US is inherently, problematic pretty much in any way. And we have yet to receive any guidance on how that, is supposed to inform our teaching or will affect our department. So what that's looking like is I'm losing more and more of my friends who are Black faculty. They are going elsewhere. It is too hostile of an environment in which for them to do their work. And this is in the context of a decreasing number of African American students attending the university, which is a PWI, and is becoming even more of one as the years progress. And so I think I can think of already like four Black faculty who I know do so much work in sustaining the environment for Black students, are having to go. People are choosing not to come to teach here, but I am happy to report that we have 3 Black feminist scholars joining our department this year in the midst of this. I don't know how we made that happen, but I'm thrilled, because that is what they want, right? They want people to leave. They want people not to come. They want people to be too scared to come. And I completely understand that everyone has to determine what feels safe for them. But those who are choosing to stay, we're doing our best right now to be in community. So a few weeks ago, I was in community with folks from a small grassroots organization called Tranquility, trans community organization in Gainesville, Florida. And they're just doing amazing work in solidarity with each other. But they're living, of course, contending with real fear. So we're having frank discussions around the possibilities of violence, right? This is what we're talking about. And there was this sense, even as we were in the event of could something happen here? People know we're gathered here. So to say that it's difficult is an understatement. And I have to give a lot of credit to my students for just being in community with us and, navigating this all with us. And right now, the future is uncertain. Administration is not even reaching out to acknowledge that this is happening, at least to us, in any kind of, meaningful way. So we feel like we're on our own. And that is how, we're moving, and at least institutionally. But I'm grateful for students and community. And I think I hope in a way that this is all a reminder to us to think about why we do what we do. And we need to be prepared for this not to be in the institution, and to remember that this knowledge isn't of it, right? And I don't know, imagine what else we can do, and understanding, of course, the critical work that happens in the academy, but it's not the be all end all. And so what does it look like to, I don't know, move into a different space, and how have we been complicit perhaps in what also has occurred? So those are just questions that I've been sitting with while all of this has been happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez. And I appreciate these questions and hearing from you where you are at this time beyond what is being reported so often in the media. Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Story.
Yeah, it's been, I loved everything you said, Jillian, in regards to having to navigate a work environment in which you're losing colleagues, you're losing friends, longstanding relationships, institutional ones even. We've lost a lot of staff in our cultural center. We've lost, tenure track faculty. We haven't been able to appeal to a large group of professors and educators who are racially diverse whatsoever. And this year has been really, really, really difficult, especially on our trans students. Now we're having, and we've had incidents of transphobia on our yard before. It seems to be more present or ever present, or at least the university or folks are reporting it more or talking about it more, but it seems to be very, very prevalent. And in our state, in Kentucky, we dealt with Senate Bill 150 and 470. And in this really, really more evil, like an evil attempt, I wouldn't say more evil than the bill itself, but an evil attempt, conservatives ended up combining because it didn't have enough time to be voted on. And so they ended up combining the bills with the bathroom bill and basically made the most transphobic bill law. It stops gender affirming care for adolescents, and youth, and it stops parents are needing to be notified on any matters related to LGBTQ identity. So parents and guardians, if their child checks out a book on gender identity or sexuality, or if they want sex ed in their classroom or something like that, then the parents are called and alerted, which is beyond terrifying. There's basically, these young people have no right to any kind of privacy with this bill. And so it's been difficult because my students, even though the bill doesn't directly affect them per se, because they're over 18 and they're college students, they were just 17, right? 2 years before that, they were just 16, and this would affect them directly. And most of my students come from backgrounds where they do not feel safe telling parents or guardians about their journeys. They do not feel comfortable doing so. And so this really, really scares them, and it makes it even, I say more difficult, because sometimes I don't even lecture. If I have something prepared on an essay this past year, I'll just start talking about what's going on in the news. And I think holding space for the students is one way that I can check in with them. You know, as Jillian mentioned, our university institutionally is not doing anything in regard to responding. I mean, they have counseling. They'll say like the counseling center is open, and this kind of group mass email, you know, that people just delete because it's on a listserv. And so, you know, holding space to talk about how this feels and how, you know, we had a small victory down the street in Nashville around a judge stopping the ban on drag, on public displays of drag in Tennessee. But yeah, it's made everything more difficult, as you know, white supremacy, capitalism, misogynoir, lies about history, you know, all those things make it just so difficult to exist, to do your job, to do it in a way that, you know, brings you and your students joy and empowerment. Sometimes you just feel down, and you feel enraged, you know, so, and the rage part is helpful, but the down part sometimes is not. And so it's been a nightmare. And at the same time, you know, folks are still pushing back against all of these things. We have like a number of great organizations in Louisville specifically that support young trans kids, like Louisville Youth Group, and like Queer Kentucky as an organization. And there's tons of grassroots on the ground support for trans youth, at least here in our city. The difficulty is having those same advocacies and safe spaces in the rest of the state. But Louisville, Lexington, and Covington, which have the fairness ordinance as a part of law. So that means LGBTQ folk won't be discriminated against in housing, jobs, those kinds of things. It's against the law in those areas, but the rest of the state is not the case. And so those resources are available, but those resources now are being really, really, really stretched. This other organization that we have here is great. It's for Black LGBTQ folk, poor folk, called Change Today, Change Tomorrow, where they literally like feed like Black and queer communities and give them things that they need and those kinds of resources. And So those, I'd say it's a both and. It's like pure hell, and then there's recovery, and there's pushback, and there's resistance at the same time.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing that. And I'm going to echo just much of all the things you both have really beautifully and dexterously said. And I'll be brief too. But I think for me, so I'm situated primarily in an African American Studies department, which has recently renamed itself to the Department of Black Studies. And I'm also situated in a Gender and Sexuality Studies program. So those two programs are my kind of departmental homes. And there have been multiple conversations that we've all had, in particular, multiple faculty meetings dedicated to thinking about how are we doing? What are the things that are happening in the world, in our lives, that are affecting the ways that we can show up for one another, to do the work that we want to do, to labor and love and care in the ways that we feel that we can and should. So I think there's, at least for me, there was a really necessary and deeply appreciated way that we acknowledge the ways that the things outside of the university are bearing on how we inhabit the university. Because so often the university as an institution promotes itself as this austere place that is kind of bastion away from all these other things, but we are inside this place in very multifaceted ways and are being affected by those things. So I think noting and acknowledging the ways that we are affected by those things was really reassuring to me and affirming to me as well. But the thing I think I want to home in on briefly is the ways that all of this has gifted me with a recommitment to my students. So I understand myself as a particular kind of thinker, scholar, academic person who is trying perpetually to recommit to students, to think about what do students need in this climate that we find ourselves in now, which has always been the climate in various kinds of ways, but it has allowed me to think about what do my students need and how does that allow me to restructure, reorient myself to the classroom space and outside the classroom space. So how do I teach in ways that are attentive to the things that are bearing on them, rather than simply the things that I think are important or interesting to learn about this field that I find myself in? How can I, in fact, be more attentive to the things that will engender their own livelihoods and sustainabilities? So I find myself really thinking about how to do that both in and outside the classroom. And I think one of the things I'm not sure about this, but I think one of the things that has done was to permit students to feel more deeply and to be more honest with themselves and one another and with me as well. There have been multiple instances where a student has emailed me and asked, can we talk like that day or the following day, because they were just feeling so very much kind of in trepidation about what is happening or about how they're feeling. And to sit on a Zoom call with a student who's just crying and trying to affirm the things that they're feeling, that to me is deeply a part of the work that I want to do. I had a student who asked to come to my office and literally just wanted a hug. Like, those small things to me are so impactful. And I think those cultivate the conditions for supporting students, for supporting young people who then will go on to do and be in scenarios and places that are being acutely affected by various laws and policies. And so I think for me, I want to try to allow them to feel that care and that love, to sustain them to do the other things that they feel that they need to do and want to do. So that's how I am trying to reorient myself with respect to all that's happening. How can I recommit to students in ways that are caring and loving and generous and capacious as well?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. You're already giving me so much to think about, and the ways that we can continue to do this work and not have it be limited, right, by the container, the structure that we're in of the university, even as it dictates so much, right, of what is going on in our work and lives as faculty and students. I have been thinking a little bit too here, even with this panel, about, you know, so many aspects of the interconnectedness of these issues, and talking with Dr. Russo about this as well. as we are thinking together today about understanding the roots of these struggles, right? And to understand the roots of the struggles might help us in responding and shaping our resistance. I was wondering if each of you might talk a bit about what you see as the roots of these attacks and these mobilizations against our fields, knowledges, and communities. Just wanting to think a little bit about that with our audience here today. So,
Yeah,
thank you.
that's such a great question. It's just so many roots, and the roots are so deep, foundational, I feel like, to our country and nation that's founded on this inequity, and dehumanization, and that is under an economic system which facilitates both of those things. And then, but what I really think contemporaneously, because most folk don't read in America or are informed rather, right, about what history is, right? Because we see the recent attacks on history. I mean, in reality, a lot of folks just don't know the founding of our country and those kinds of struggles. They just don't. And so what I think in my hypotheses is that folks got empowered. Folks are feeling empowered. I'd say forever, right? Because I think that communities of color, marginalized, minoritized communities have always pushed back, have always resisted, have always sought to persevere through struggle and oppression and the like. But I think that what conservatives in particular started seeing was the empowerment that came along with students coming out with degrees in women and gender studies, coming out with degrees in queer studies or LGBT studies, students rebuffing, right, their own children at the dinner table. I mean, look at, Ted Cruz's daughter. She's like, I don't want nothing to do with him, right? I don't want nothing to do with him. He's a hate monger. He's trash, right? And he's trash because he views humanity in this really skewed way that, white supremacy and capitalism and all these things tell us the way that he should. And so his daughter is like, I don't want anything to do with that. You had here in Kentucky, for instance, these high school students had this huge walkout in response to SB 150. These young folk are not interested in this racism and this casual homophobia and trans. So they're just not off that, and they're not for that. And I think with the conservatives, it's happening in their own households. Their own households are saying to them, your stuff is antiquated. I'm not interested in that. You're dehumanizing people. These are my friends. These are my comrades. These are the people, who I admire, I'm inspired by. I think that the visibility of the righteousness of LGBTQ folk, Black folk is really coming into people's homes now through film, television, documentaries, all of these things. And young people are watching them, and I feel like they're pushing back on these conservatives. And this is why they just got hip to critical race theory, right? Critical race theory been around, right? But why are they just now getting hip to it? Why are they like, no, critical race theory all of a sudden? And it's because they're being confronted with it in intimate spaces, I think, in spaces they think are safe for white supremacy, are safe for classism, are safe for homophobia and transphobia, and they're being challenged in these spaces. And they're like, we're gonna have to create a law because y'all is wild, and my kids is saying they non-binary, my white friends with this gay man across the street, like, something's, I mean, to me, because it isn't based in fact. It's not even based in thought or critical thinking at all, right? These laws are literally about suppression and fascism and denial and lies, and so what is this deep investment really about? It has to be about that there's some kind of personal affront. And even if those things don't exist, the fact that queer folk, trans folk, everybody's out here getting their life, and people are seeing it, I think that the audacity of that joy and that visibility and that freedom is unnerving. So even if it's not in their personal households, they feel personally affronted by witnessing it. How dare you walk around Black, queer, and free like this and unafraid? And you ain't moving off the sidewalk neither. And you have self-esteem, and you're going on trips and you're living your life. How dare you, right? Where I'm sitting here struggling. right? Financially. And my family's been poor for generations and we're white, right? That's why they don't believe white privilege and all this kind of stuff. Like those things have, white privilege is not about your life not being hard. It's not hard because you're white, right? It hasn't been made hard because of the whiteness. Like, duh, but they see it as something completely different. And so that the deep investment in those things, the personal affront, and I feel that way about homophobes too. I feel like homophobic people are like that. I feel like they're jealous. I feel like like the root is envy, the envy of freedom, the envy of audacity. And I mean, I know it's deeper than all of those things. That's why I said it's just like my hypothesis for conversation. I would never like write it down or anything, but it's so personalized. And for these folks to write these laws, not know any trans people, not know any queer people, not know anything about Black history, not know anything about American history, and then construct a whole legal brief and want to make it law, there's a deep seated investment in that. And I think it's the freedom that all of these groups represent, the audacity, and our departments, Black studies, women and gender studies, sexuality studies, that's exactly what those departments are, right? When they're done right and they are right, that's what they manifest are. They're an empowering and liberatory type of field because they're teaching you about everything at the same time, unlike traditional disciplines, right? That are only valorizing certain folks with certain identities and a certain past. And I think feminist studies and those they challenge those things. And I think that's what that transforms the mind and folks. And they're mad about it. So I feel like definitely the roots are old, historical, and ancient. I think this upsurgence though has to do with this visibility, social media, the fact that everybody has access to all types of communities now and all types of conversations in those communities. And these conservatives don't like what's coming out of communities of color, working class communities, LGBTQ communities. They don't like it. They're like, what? You walking around here feeling it? Like, no.
Thank you. Yes, I'm picturing that, Dr. Story, of like the conversation around the dinner table, and when they say protect our children, he's really talking about my children. It's always been about protecting white children, right? But that it's just the picture you painted of like, no, protect my children, protect me from my children is really going on there. And that's anyway, really, really interesting. And thank you for also thinking across like those historic and ancient roots of this country, like you're saying, and this moment that they can't kind of rebottle, that you were pointing out, like they can't rebottle this, the knowledges that are circulating and flowing.
I think also, right, it's very much a response to 2020 and all the movement we saw in 2020, where a broad public, this was not limited to Black communities only, like made it clear that they're not standing for anti-Black violence, right? And so that's why I'm also like, I want to be careful not to give these initiatives like they're definitely flexing power, but let's be clear that they're only doing so because they're confronting power. So I just want to be so careful in not giving it all more credit than I think it warrants, because I do agree. I do agree with Kayla around the fact that like the young folks, like they're embarrassed and horrified. Like my students who take, students in my class that like a bunch of non-majors take, they're not even that invested in women's studies, but they're just like, this is straight up embarrassing. I hate telling people that I'm from Florida, right? And so the way in which these initiatives are alienating folks who actually might, sometimes be in solidarity with them, so like I had an Uber driver take me to the airport and he was like, oh, my sister is in like in the Department of Forestry Management, but is having her emails scrubbed because she sat on like some diversity committee that like wasn't even really like, as we know they weren't really doing much. That's a whole other conversation. But all that to say, right, like, he's not invested, his sister wasn't invested, but now all of a sudden they're feeling like, what are you guys doing? right? And so it's radicalizing folks who like might not have been, right, until they're feeling that like overreach. So I think they're also misstepping in really, I'm trying to use better language, but they're miscalculating, I think, ultimately, because I don't think they're thinking through what these tactics sort of like, what is the end line of this, right? And the ways in which it's creating inroads for even some schools of thought that like conservative folks are down with, to eventually perhaps also be scrubbed from curriculum, right? So it's interesting how so much of is around freedom, but it's clear that it's like freedom of discourse, like only for, right, particular views, for particular for particular thoughts. So yeah, it's been, I do think that effort that's being put in is very much, I agree, a response to seeing the change and the power has been manifested. So it's a desperate attempt to containing something that it's too late. Like that ship has sailed. Young people are creating a different world. Like that's already happened. I'm so sorry to tell folks.
Thank you. Yes. And it does have me thinking too a little bit, Jillian, as well, about, with Chandan Reddy's argument around that freedom, right? It always comes with violence. There are particular notions of freedoms in the US, but they've always been predicated on violence. Yeah.
Yeah, so I need to stop going last because now I need to follow all these. So I
Have you go first next time. Yeah, the next one.
So I'll actually be brief now because I don't actually have much to add. But I think one thing I will say, and there are of course many roots to all of this. It's incredibly multifaceted. But I think one of the things too that I think about is the ways that there is a certain kind of hegemonic articulation of what it means to inhabit or to be of or from this particular landscape, this nation, country, however we want to draw those nationalistic borders, and to articulate it in such a way that then bears on how one understands themselves in the contemporary moment in a certain kind of way. And so for various kinds of departments, modes of thinking, disciplines, etc., to then speak about the horrors of that foundational truth, that then feels like a personal attack, a personal affront. So then I think the backlash comes in when that foundation is cracked. Now, I guess this is very much Jane Baldwin in My Dungeon Shook. What is that? I forget the line. Like if you wake up and the sun is on fire and the stars are ablaze, like that kind of fundamental fracture and interrogation of that sense of yourself, who you are, what you mean, what you're destined to be, and all that kind of stuff. So to then have fields of study that are predicated on that fracturing means that there needs to be, at least from that vantage, an outright assault on these fields in order to conserve. I guess this is very much where conservatism comes from, in order to conserve this understanding of myself as the kind of top of this scheme, as the head of this patriarchal white supremacist household. So I think in large part it's coming from, we can understand it as fear. We can also understand it as a kind of reinscription of what it means to fundamentally be this kind of person, entity, subject that is inhabiting this space. So I think it's coming from very much that kind of angle, that scope, in order to try to preserve what they understand themselves to be, as well as their own articulation of what this place is. And to fracture that then will be met with a certain kind of backlash, because they're understanding themselves as under assault via this fracturing and interrogating and counter kind of history of what this nation place has been said to be.
Thank you all so much. And yeah, you have me thinking so many things. And I really appreciate what you all have pointed out and how you have really all added to this conversation. And I wanted to maybe ask a question to think to, you're already gesturing to this with thinking about the roots of these issues, but as we think about interconnectedness between and among among these issues, right? Because typically we are also taught, we're kept from many of these knowledges. I mean, what you brought up too, Dr. Story, you were saying, oh, well, they're not necessarily reading. And I'm thinking, yes, exactly. And also being kept from being able to read or being able to access these histories, right? So this is all part of that. And I wanted to think with you all a little bit about interconnectedness between and among these various sites. And also, as I was thinking about talking with you all today, I thought, I was so glad to see the connections here in our panelists between the Midwest and the South. So even like interconnectedness between and among these issues as they're happening in these different local and geographical spaces, but as if to think like they're not happening here in Chicago or something would be right, would be sort of a misnomer. So so the question here would be, how might you all help us think of building to a more connected movement response, or how our various interdisciplines, students and faculty can think about interconnections between and among us, right? Even as you were saying, Dr. Hernandez, the student being like, oh, I'm so embarrassed to be from Florida, and yet, right, and yet these things are not only happening in Florida, and yet they're very much, there's they're brought into stark relief right now in Florida and Texas and Kentucky and things. So yeah, how do you all see, right, these attacks that are coming from multiple issues, multiple fronts, book bans, attacks on gender affirming care, attacks on our histories and our communities? Like, what do you see in terms of the interconnectedness there? And or maybe differences among these types of attacks as well that we might want to hold on to. Additionally, we might want to hold on to some of those differences. But as we think about moving forward, right? How can we think about interconnectedness? And yes, and maybe Dr. Bay, you want to go first here, and we'll move from there. Thank you.
I can, thank you. So, yeah, I'll just get us kicked off because I'm quite interested to see what my co-panelists have to say on this. But what I'll say is that I think in terms of interconnectedness, there is. So if we think about bans on, say, what is understood as critical race theory, and how that is in large part a preservation of whiteness and white supremacy, to attempt to disband and invalidate numerous understandings of Black liberation, about with respect to slavery, the history of slavery, all those kind of things. If that's an attempt to preserve whiteness and white supremacy, I think it's also necessary to understand the ways that whiteness and white supremacy is predicated on a certain notion of the patriarchal nuclear family, this preservation of the properness or a kind of proper way of being in relation to one another, and thus how to then be productive citizens, laborers, etc., which is then, I think, also predicated on a notion of gender normativity. So you need to be not only a proper family, but a proper subject in relation to that family. And all these things who are articulated through a certain notion of a kind of middle class livelihood. So all these things, I think, have to be the assault on in terms of the rights has to be interconnected with all these things, because if one thing falls, then all these other things, maybe they don't fall immediately, but they are thrown into a certain kind of crisis that then allows people to begin to interrogate this thing and that thing and that thing. So I think the fragility, the absolute fragility of this notion of not a white supremacist heteropatriarchy. The fragility of that means that it needs to preserve all the aspects of it, because if one begins to dissolve, then all the other things begin to come into question. So I think all of the assaults coming from all these different angles are predicated on this notion that all of this is very much interconnected. And so I think that's why we're seeing a whole bunch of attacks on various kinds of fields, identities, modes of thinking, etc.
Indeed.
I mean, I also think that, I hope that the moment also sort of like reinvigorates certain conversations, and I mean, and these conversations have been had about how for many decades, you know, broadly speaking, feminist and queer studies haven't really sufficiently dealt with, you know, race and class. And I think that sort of fracturing, you know, allows for the kind of moment that we're in right now. And so really, I think thinking about, again, like what this all means for the knowledge that we produce and how we produce it, who do we produce it with, how do we present it, you know, in classrooms, but also not just in classrooms, right? In communities, what is our responsibility to community? So I think, you know, thinking also about how interconnectedness, you know, feminists of color have been sort of calling for that for a long time, but that hasn't always borne out in the kind of like broader sort of formation of feminist and queer studies. And I think in some ways, you know, that has not allowed for us to develop sufficient interconnectedness to maybe have prevented perhaps a moment like this one. I don't know if that was possible, but all that to say, maybe had more tools and more solidarity on that front.
Yes, I agree. I do think that there's been a lack of interconnectedness in disciplines that are known as interdisciplinary, which is ironic and scary at the same time. But I think that at the university level, we should, in the programmatic level, do that. Like what I've noticed is if I go to a women in gender studies event, not many folks from Black studies will be at that event. And if I go to a Black studies event, not that many folks from women in gender studies will be at that event, as if, you know, you don't have professors who are duly appointed in both departments, and you also have students who take classes in both departments, and there doesn't seem to be much cross-pollination that's happening, even though we're in interdisciplinary fields. And so I think that can be a start. You know, I think that's what I love about interdisciplinary work is that, you know, you're basically writing and reading and teaching from all of these, a variety of perspectives, not just this, you know, teaching from the perspective of a historian, right? So you're doing it as a, you know, a queer anarchist, as a feminist, as a, you know, anti-racist, all these kinds of things at the same time. And I think that, of course, us on this panel and us here in community together do that, but we have a lot of professors in these disciplines that don't be doing that at all. And I think that the disconnect lies, like, you know, it shouldn't be the case that Black studies still be having an issue with queerness and LGBT stuff. I mean, you know, it's just like, I mean, you got young folk listening to Umar Johnson and his nonsense, his old remixed, recycled Black nationalism, you know what I mean? That's being repackaged for folks in accessible ways. And they feel like, yes, my commitment to Black people and Black liberation is all about patriarchy and misogyny and capitalism and accessing power like a white man. And you know what I mean? It's like, this is an old conversation, but you have some folks who are out teaching stuff like that. And, you know, I thought that went away with grad school, you know, when I encountered those kinds of things in my grad school experience. And you have a lot of like white supremacist feminists going on, right? Who feel as if it's the duty of women of color in their department to teach Black feminism, to teach a kind of feminism. Like if you're going to learn women of color feminisms, you're going to learn it from one of the practitioners, not me as a white woman, and I'm not going to familiarize myself with it, even though I'm supposedly an intellectual. So I think that those things, you know, this should reinvigorate all of us. As Marquise was saying, it should reinvigorate all of us in our work to kind of start cross-pollinating at the university level. And I know for the community level, the thing that's beautiful about social media, to me, is that it can get the word out in a really rapid fire way without you having to send stuff to listservs and those kinds of things, but just sharing what's going on in other cities. Like if stuff is happening here in Kentucky and in Louisville, but there's also, they're banning Georgia M. Johnson's book again at another library. I'm gonna like use my platform, and I don't have like no big following or nothing, but it's just my way of like getting the kind of message out there for the audience that I have. And then the audience that I have will reflect that back where, gosh, this is what's happening in Texas. This is what's happening in Florida. This is what's happening in Chicago. This is what's happening, right? And because all those folks in these different states and cities are made up of you, right? They reflect your identity, and also people you're in community with in your own state. And they're doing these kinds of attacks. And I think that just for us to familiarize ourselves with what's going on in other parts of the state and parts of the world. And I know we all already do this, right? But I think this is a good way to understand how deep and wide the attacks on critical race theory, book banning, pride festivals, drag, trans kids, gender affirming care, all those things that are going on, all of this legislation in response to, as Jillian said, power. As response to power, as response to, empower communities, like that's a way for us to kind of build like strength in those ways. And then it's like fun because you like don't have to like leave your house. You can just be in the house and still be active and activated and advocate, It's a real accessible way is what
I also just want to quickly add though that one troubling thing that I'm seeing is along with this is like the visibility of TERF, like of trans exclusionary feminism. So like what's going on, right? Like, there's something around the question of the meaning and the autonomy around the body at a very fundamental level that transness is signifying, even in feminist spaces, right? That is such an affront, and like really thinking about what work that's doing. Like, I don't have an answer, Marquise, maybe you have thoughts on this, but like, what is up with like high key TERFism right now? Because that is right there along with it. It's kind of like we're back in that sort of like anti-porn feminists working with conservatives, in the 90s moment with trans exclusionary feminism. And so to think that even within, or like Kayla mentioned, right, like this budding resurgence of patriarchal ethno-nationalism, like, so like the fight is outside, but it's inside too, right? It's so difficult.
it is. And I talk about TERFs a lot in my class, and how I hate them and I can't stand them and they're despicable. And I think that they got really, really emboldened. And I guess they've been doing this movement, this TERF movement from the UK all the way to the United States for like 20 years or something. But I feel like old girl, J.K. Rowling, when she started her TERFism and doing all that and getting buck, I feel like, you had other folks. I mean, you got Bette Midler. I mean, you got these people that's like queer icons talking about Bette Midler. She's like, they're calling us birthing people. Do you remember her tweet? And then she had another tweet which she was saying that women are the N-word or something. I mean, she's just like,
Yeah.
He's, and then Macy Gray, right? Another kind of LGBT icon, queer icon, who's like, you're, denying that trans women are women. I mean, just like, oh my God. I mean, to me, and I don't know. I think that, again, to me, that has something to do with visibility too. I think, and it seems like, I feel like, a lot of folks want to give TERFs like all of this like thinking. And I really just think it's like a Mean Girls Club. They're jealous because they have to compete against trans women for cis men's attention. They're tired of it. I mean, and that's all. I mean, I feel like cis women tend to like envy trans women's bodies. I feel like their shaves. I mean, every time I go to the gay club and there's like a femme queen like performing, they're like, oh my God, can you believe that? Can you believe their assignment at birth? It's like, yeah, yes, I can. I mean, what do you want, right? Like they're always gagging and always overwhelmed by the beauty of trans women. And I really think that has everything to do with it. Because it's not based on fact or science, right? J.K. Rowling spewing her turfism about bathrooms and public safety is not even statistically or any kind of sound rationale. It's never, ever happened, right?
Yeah, it is. And the way in which it erases the violence that trans women face,
Yes.
it's just wild. It's wild. Like, you can't even compare, right?
They act like everybody grew up in a household with 4 bathrooms. I don't think so. Everybody, you know what I mean? So somehow the public restroom is all of this, but so you grew up with 3 bedrooms in your crib, which everybody was assigned a gender, and they went to the respective bathrooms. No, you didn't. You shared that bathroom, 6 of y'all, 5 of y'all, 4 of y'all. Stop acting like that. You know what I mean? And I really think that's it. I mean, I do. I see it as, I just remember what was the whole incident with Cece and the woman who ignited the violence that night with Dean Schmidt, Molly. All she was telling the police the whole time was that, you know, Cece was just so pretty. Cece McDonald, she was so pretty. She was so pretty. Almost that she didn't believe it, right? And so was that what it was? Or is it because somehow trans folk are unholy or whatever kind of rationale made up? And I don't think it's any of that. I just think it's like, gosh, you know, I already had to deal with cis women for these dudes. And now I got to deal with trans women too. And I feel like they're prettier. I don't know. Because it's not scientific, it's not even smart sounding. And you got this woman with this multi-million-dollar empire who's willing to just trash it because of her stupid views, and her dehumanizing, reductive views. And the same with these celebrities. To me, turfism is so antithetical to feminism. And so I just don't get how they make these connections. But I think it's what you said earlier, Julia, the fracturing, right? So I think that J.K. Rowling honestly believes she's some kind of feminist. She believes that she's a woman who's empowered. She believes, right? And I think it's because of that corporatized feminism, you know, those like women empowerment lunches that people have. And all it is about like wearing business suits and, you know, being this kind of corporate type feminist. I don't know. I don't know how to explain I don't know. It just, to me, that's the only thing I can think of. It's like, why is this such an issue? I mean, it's so clear that it's dehumanizing, it's degrading, it's evil, and it's ahistorical, right? Because trans women have been existing, right? So it's not just because you turn on your TV and Pose came on that's all of a sudden trans people exist. It's like, no, we've been here, right? They've been here, right? So like, I just feel like outside of just being plain stupid, I feel like it has to be the envy thing. These kids is mad. They're mad about they're mad. They're mad about the empowerment, I think.
I appreciate what you all are saying in terms of also, though, right, as you all are talking, getting us to think about what we're invested in, you know, and that this can be a moment to really reflect on that. Because you all are just reminding me about how we get invested in certain, right, articulations of ourselves, right, or certain ways in which we show up, you know, as subjects in the world. I think you were sort of saying too, Dr. Bay, about a reinscription, right, of the person, the subject, you know, and the preservation of that, and that we're also invested in that. So thank you all for reminding us of that at this moment, that we could be doing that, each of us personally, but also within, you know, our units that, you know, where we're doing this work, or we're charged with doing this work. And also, can I just say too, as we're watching time, can please, folks in the audience, if you would like to start thinking of your questions for the panel and even typing them in, like we've seen some here. I think I will just close here with asking the panel, kind of on that note, what you were all already saying. I wanted to just ask sort of a closing question here, and then get to more questions from our students and other faculty and et cetera. That, you know, just how are you thinking about, you know, sort of enacting a politics of refusal to succumb, right, to these attacks, right? So what are you considering about how we have to, what are you imagining and envisioning of how we might challenge, resist, and undermine these attacks? And one of the examples I just wanted to use really quickly was, I was thinking again the other day about the NAA, that's why I mentioned it in the opening, the NAACP, and issuing this travel advisory, which was really an attempt, right, to shine a light on what's going on, so important. And yet, folks, right, in Florida on the ground, communities feeling erased, right, feeling overlooked, right, and that then we can also engage in that we might be then overlooking what is going on, right, and how communities are resisting. So how might we do this work now without doing that, right, ignoring and erasing the resistance that is already happening? And then I know too, this might also be a great opportunity, Dr. Hernandez, for you to show also what your students, as we're thinking about considering, imagining, envisioning a future, right, that isn't just having to be responsive, or maybe we will have to be constantly responsive to this. So your thoughts on that, folks, please.
Well, while folks think, I will share, and I think they're here in the Zoom. Ceci Luna is one of our brilliant MA students in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and definitely Ceci and I have been having many, many conversations, and along with the other students, around what this all means. And so Ceci was taking a course in visual anthropology and decided to make the project around what's happening. And I just want to share the images. They're going to say everything they need to say, but while I prepare to share them, really thinking about art making as praxis, right? And so this is a series of images that Ceci created, inspired by a quote. The quote is by Mariam Kaba, and it says, let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. So I will share some of the images from this now. Let me pull it up. Let me just scroll here to the images. So this is the view outside of our building. And so outside of our building, it has like the sign onto which Ceci overlaid SOS, help, protect, and save. So this is the first image called Gender Studies Under Attack. And this is the image that really almost brought me to tears. It's called the Last Advanced Feminist Theory class. So it's a shot of Ceci, looking at the board, and we see Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Gloria Anzaldúa, and you see like the areas of study that are being banned, sort of, X'd out. So queer theory, intersectionality, critical race theory, feminist theory. So kind of imagining they're both like dystopian and utopian at the same time. So it's one of the images, the image on top here is from our library on the top floor of our department with the books redacted. And then the other is a view of our department that says in memoriam, rest in power, the end of gender studies. So like imagining, imagining what that would look like, but then really thinking through the moment as one, right, drawing on Kaba to think about this as a moment for like radical thought and praxis. So this is Ceci in the grad lounge doing the work, because it is that they want to take us away from the work that we're doing, like the writing, the thinking, that is precisely what's under attack. And then love this. This is a view from the grad office where the grad students kind of hang out and study, and just this moment of joy, right? This moment of like the everydayness of being a WGS student, and what that looks like. And this is the final image from the series with two of our students, gender studies forever. So, you know, again, in such a difficult moment that Ceci could sort of create this series of images that at one point, right, have are thinking about the dystopia of the moment, but also the joy, the everydayness, and the resistance. So thank you so much, Ceci. Thank you so much for being in it with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Ceci, and thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you. Amazing. Great. If anyone else too would like to speak to, just things you're imagining about resisting and moving forward, that would be, we'd love to hear it. And then we'll take some questions in our remaining time from everyone else in the audience. We'd love to invite you all to bring your questions. Thank you.
I echo Jillian in that just to continue to do what we've always done in the sense of pushing back on all of these things, to continue that work, showing up, being present. I have students do zines in my class for their final assignments where they get to imagine a future self. I have this assignment called biomythography, which is based on Lord's biomythography. So it allows them to put their own themselves in the place in the world and to think about how they were raised, what things influence them, what they want the world to look like when they feel like they're officially grown. Because even though they're technically grown, they don't feel grown. And so those types of things, keep assigning those types of things, keep teaching, truth above everything, keep maintain those commitments to activist organizations that you are already a part of. And I definitely believe in art too. I think that art is just so powerful, and I think that I think Jillian's is exactly right, is that these attacks are stemming from the fact that this work is already underway. This work is already taking place. The empowerment, the solidarity, the coalition building, these things are happening, and so keep investing in those things. And just as we were, unafraid before all of this insurgence of attacks, just maintain that. Because I mean, what is there other than that, right? What else? I think that, yeah, excellent.
Yeah, and I'll say briefly too, and I'm apologizing in advance too, because I have another talk that I have to go to, so I won't be able to stay for the duration of the Q&A, but please do feel free to reach out if you have things that you want to ask or talk about with me. But what I'll say is, and I'll be brief, that two things. One, I do not think that there's any realm of life where resistance can't happen. So all of the realms that you might find yourself in, you can be a basement dwelling gamer, and there's still things that you can do, still ways that you can affect change and all of that. So I want us to always recognize and acknowledge the spaces that we find ourselves in, and how can we show up in those spaces to make some kind of a change, as small as it may be, but some kind of a change, I think. Then the second thing I'll say, and this is, I've talked about Baldwin before, and I'm always talking about James Baldwin in a whole bunch of ways, but a sense of love, a sense of kind of radical love, to me can be so powerful, and that can look a whole number of ways. But I think for me, a kind of trying to move through a sense of love for not only for other people in our communities, but also people, this is kind of a formulation that I've been thinking about for a while now, but showing a sense of love and dedication to the people, beings that we don't even know are there yet. Like, how can we cultivate the conditions for people that we don't even know exist yet to feel that they can show up in the world? Like, that I think is a profound sense of love. And so I want to try to always think about those two things: the sense that there's no realm of life where resistance cannot happen, and how can we proliferate love in the various ways, in the various spaces that we find ourselves in.
Thank you all so much. I think there's just so much more that we could spend a lot more time talking about. And I guess I really want to thank you all right now and just take a moment to thank you all for what you've offered. So maybe we can do that at this moment, and then and just thank our panelists so much. And we do have a couple of questions, and for those who can hang out, we have about, I'm doing a time check with Professor Russo, but we have 2 questions already in the chat. One is sort of asking about mobilizing youth and getting youth involved in terms of like civic engagement and getting them, sort of at the voting booth. It looks like Fredo is asking, right? The youth are fired up and vocal, but how do we get them, engaged civically and like at the voting booth? And the other question too is kind of like around like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be thinking about these traditional sites of voting and voting rights. So do folks have comments on that as well before we would go? Those questions, and I'm trying to see who else. Oh, Marquise had to leave. Okay. Yeah, so thoughts on that, like civic engagement, democracy and rights, right? Voting at this moment.
Yeah,
Oof.
I think that traditional civic engagement is still important. I do think that voting is important. I don't think that it is, it's something I think that needs to be told to young people as something that the system that we're working in right now, but it's not this assurance, because I've noticed with my students, you get them all fired up to vote. You take them with you, you organize rides for them. And then when the election doesn't go their way or a bill still becomes law, they go to Frankfurt, they protest, and it doesn't come out to be what they anticipated. There has to be a conversation around this is an avenue and this is a one pathway, and that there are multiple and many pathways for us to resist the attacks and the things that are happening. It doesn't mean that civic engagement is not important and voting is not important and mobilizing voting isn't. It certainly is, but there are also other types of ways to resist and to push back against these things. So I mean, ideas in terms of getting young people to the actual polls to do it. The only way I've tried to do it is I won't have class on days where we have like major elections, particularly local state elections, which have a lot more bearing on our lived everyday experiences. But they'd be like, thanks, Dr. Story, but they don't be going. So it's something where I don't know. I don't know how. I know that there's a number. I mentioned earlier, Change Today, Change Tomorrow. That organization drives folks of all ages to the polls. It gives them rides, picks them up. Our busing system here in Louisville isn't the best. And so voting does become an issue a lot of times if students don't have a car and they don't have access to a car. So if you're somebody who does have that kind of access, right, to offer to drive, some folks to the polls or to point out where they are, other than that, I'm not sure as to how to mobilize them to do it and to actually show up that day. I think that they are, though. I think that they're really going. I mean, I saw so many young people when we had SB and all these bills come through, and the Kentucky state legislator, they were in Frankfurt. I mean, they were driving that hour and a half, they were carpooling, they were going to Frankfurt to protest and push back. So, but I think that traditional modes of pushback are valid and important. I just wanted to be clear that it's not the only and all and be all way.
Oh, Dr. Farah, please. See your hand. Thank you.
I'm still trying to figure out how to unmute. Thank you so much, all of you. I think the thing that my biggest takeaway in terms of thinking about my students and myself and our community here and the national community and then the international community that I'm certainly I pay close attention and involve myself in. But one of the things that strikes me as so powerful about this evening's discussion is really thinking about the multiple levels of ways of thinking, multiple ways of resisting, and how they are interconnected. And part of the reason, Kyla, that there is so many pissed off elder white men right now, especially cis white men, but I would argue in general, that this notion that people, it's one is the uppity, right? And that how dare you step out of your place, as if this place was one of choice, A, and B, as if one who is feeling, as so many of us are feeling, are going to keep our mouth shut like that. In what reality would that happen? And in what reality, as Jillian said, do we not tell it, talk to our students about this? Like, how do we, and so in our experience here, but I think that this intersection of understanding our interconnected histories and our interconnected ways of resisting the oppressions resulting from those, right? And really deeply contextualizing both the problems, but also the struggles, always, already both and I think I try to do that every day of my work, and I really appreciated the uplift of that so much in this discussion. So thank you very much for giving us that flow and connect, and having so many spaces to come in and connect with it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like we are right about at time, and I just want to thank you all again so much. This was such an enriching conversation, even being, in these fields and being able to talk with you all. And so that's also something I'm taking with me today, right? This idea that we exist in these interdisciplines, and yet we're not always able to even be, sometimes we're siloed in our universities and in these spaces where we are. So it's really powerful to have these conversations across units, across state lines, across these institutions and beyond, and to be able to think with you all about, yes, continuing to do this work no matter what. Thank you all so much. Dr. Russo, is there anything else for us tonight before we go?
I just want to also just, profound gratitude for this conversation. I think there's so much to think about. And one of the things I was thinking about is really like, we named this ongoing struggle, and it's also ongoing resistance and ongoing existence and ongoing joy and community and love. So I felt like that was another theme that ran through it, right? And some of your, just some of the words that you offered tonight are words that I'm going to take with me, and I'm going to share with others, because I think it's a profoundly difficult moment. It's in a profoundly amazing moment, and it's not disconnected from what we've been doing all along, what so many people have been doing before us, right? And centuries before us, and then what we're offering to the future that we're trying to create. I know that these conversations will continue next year at DePaul. I'm pretty sure that the Social Research Collaborative will be organizing some events, and I'm sure WGS and the Women's Center and other programs will. So I hope people will stay tuned. And I just want to thank our speakers and our moderator. Thank you so much, Kyla and Jillian and Heather. Yay! And if we could all, maybe people could put thank you in the chat, and we'll see you soon. So thank you, everybody. Thank you,
everyone.
Social Transformation Research
Collaborative. Yes. Thank you all so much for being here and for investing your time in these conversations.
Thank you.